Good evening. I'm addressing you tonight as the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, a British political party with hundreds of thousands of voters, members and supporters the length and breadth of the land. I want to make clear right at the outset that we are not a pacifist party. In fact, we're the only party I know of our kind which has a thriving veterans association within our membership. And one of our deputy leaders and a HUD, a railway workers leader, is in fact himself a 20-year veteran of the Royal Navy. So nothing that I'm going to say this evening is in any way to disrespect our armed forces or to deny that sometimes wars have to be fought. We stand for a proper and properly funded defense for Great Britain. If anyone were to seek to harm our country and its legitimate interests, I stress legitimate interests, we would be in the first ranks of those volunteering to serve to defend our country. Both of my great grandfathers and both of my grandfathers were fighters in the British Armed Forces. One of them, an Irishman, who, notwithstanding being both a communist and an Irish Republican, volunteered to join the British Army and fought his way across North Africa and up the length of Italy under Montgomery in the 8th Army. I hope I've made clear that when I say that we regard with horror and absolute defiant opposition the statement made by the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer yesterday after his meeting with the EU leaders in Paris, that Britain was going to commit forces on the ground, young men and even women, to die perchance to defend the Zelensky regime in Ukraine. We completely oppose this on multiple levels. First of all, I'm not sure what Keir Starmer was doing in Paris. Most of us were under the impression that we had left the EU. It's abundantly clear over the last 7 months that Keir Starmer seeks to bring us closer and closer alongside, if not inside, the European Union again. A failing European Union that is now a hallmark for corruption and incompetence, and in the last few days, a hallmark of the warmongering belligerence, now, I'm glad to say, now absent from Washington, but instead being echoed from Brussels. The second reason why we oppose what Keir Starmer said after that meeting, we don't know, of course, what he said at that meeting, was the carefully placed articles in the conservative press, the Daily Telegraph in particular, that 10,000 British soldiers will be sent to Ukraine after the war has ended. This last statement is intended to inoculate the stance of the British government against too great a backlash from the British people, and I intend tonight to pick that statement apart. We have an armed forces so shrunken that it could fit comfortably into Wembley Stadium. We have 76,000 members of the British Army, only half of whom could be vaguely described as fighting forces, and 25% of them at any one time are not available for duty for one reason or another. This means that Keir Starmer is proposing to commit a quarter or even a third of the entire strength of the British Army to put its boots on the ground, take its weapons with them in defense of Zelensky in Ukraine, leaving our country essentially defenseless. We can't guard our own borders, but we're going to send a quarter or a third of the British Armed Forces to defend Zelensky's borders, such as they are, and I will come to that, I promise you. We believe that the British Army, underpaid, underhoused, under-armoured, ill-equipped, and undertrained, is simply not capable of being sent on an expeditionary force to a war against a hypersonically nuclear-armed superpower, and one which, moreover, now seems to be getting alongside the biggest superpower, the Donald Trump United States of America. Keir Starmer effectively declared war on Russia a long time ago, but in the last few days, he's effectively declaring war on Donald Trump and the United States of America at the same time. I've heard of the folly of fighting wars on two fronts, but that, my dear friends, is patently ridiculous. But it's not just because we are not capable of forming any meaningful expeditionary force in Ukraine that we oppose this statement, this stance of the British government. We believe that it flows from an irrational, deep, and centuries-old hatred amongst the British establishment for the people of Russia. And lest you think I'm speaking up for Bolshevik Russia or Putin's Russia, I'm not. Our ancient hatred with Russia goes back to the early part of the 19th century, before Bolshevism, before Putin were ever dreamt of. It was an imperial rivalry to begin with, but as neither Russia nor Britain has an empire any longer, it can be described as irrational, an irrational hatred. From the beginning of the Ukraine war, it has been clear that the British government, more than any government in the world, more even than Joe Biden, more even than little soldier Schurz and Anna Baerbock in Germany, the British government, British governments under successive British prime ministers who have been driving the refusal to recognize the root causes of this war and refusing any idea of a negotiated settlement to it. And that's not something that we in the Workers' Party can accept. We demand rational government from those supposedly in charge of our national affairs. We demand from our government a proper calibration of British interests and, above all, of the British working class's interests. That has not been happening. The British have been right at the forefront. Boris Johnson actually went to Kiev to wreck the peace agreement, which had been initialed by Zelensky himself in Istanbul at the very beginning of this war, which could have brought it to a close 1 million lives ago. It was Boris Johnson who went to Kiev to bludgeon and perhaps to bribe Volodymyr Zelensky to continue the war on promises which have turned out to be hollow, if not false. We now hear from the NATO leaders that Ukraine would never have been allowed to join the NATO military alliance. We now hear from the same people that neither will it be allowed to join the European Union, or at least it's somewhere at the back of Armenia in the queue to do so. These statements can only have been hollow or indeed false, but they persuaded Zelensky to tear up the peace agreement. By the way, the British government was also complicit in the clear, now openly admitted, breach of the Minsk II agreements, which could have stopped this war before it even started. We were not a guarantor of Minsk II. The Germans and the French and then the Security Council were the guarantors of the Minsk II agreement. But we did everything we could to use the time bought by the Minsk II agreement to arm, to train, and to interpolate British special forces and other security services who must remain nameless, to prepare for an inevitable showdown, which the British were determined to do. Little Ben Wallace, when he was our defense minister, openly talked to me about the need for revenge for his ancestors in the Royal Scots Guards, who were amongst the gallant who rode into the valley of death in the charge of the Light Brigade. These revanchist, foolish, ancient hatreds are what has driven Britain's role in this conflict. It was the British who pushed for Storm Shadow missiles to be allowed to be fired deep inside Russian territory. There are good reasons for believing that it was the British state which planned and helped execute the ill-fated, doomed, latter-day charge of the Light Brigade, of the young Ukrainian men in their incursion into Kursk, of all places. Anyone who knows the history of the Second World War will know of the importance of Kursk. It was the British what done it. It was the British that pushed Zelensky into a madcap adventure which has cost the lives of tens, maybe scores of thousands of young Ukrainian conscripts, now as young as 16, now as old as 60. So the British have played a particularly despicable role in the conflict in Ukraine. We've actually invaded Russia 3 times. I'm not sure if everybody knows that. We sent more than 100,000 soldiers to invade Russia twice during the civil war after the Russian Revolution. 108,000 at Murmansk invading Russia. We have too much baggage with Russia for the idea that we can be peacekeepers between the Ukrainian and Russian lines to be a particularly bonkers idea. And Sergei Lavrov, the world heavyweight champion of diplomacy, made it very clear today that no NATO forces, however flagged, whether flagged as EU forces or flagged under their own national flag, will be acceptable in Ukraine when the war ends. That's the end for Keir Starmer's plan, or it ought to be. But knowing Keir Starmer, we cannot be sure that it will be. It's the end because it means that anybody coming as a peacekeeper, when Russia has declared their presence unacceptable, means that those forces will be subject to military attack. Our 10,000 men will be the equivalent of the 600 that rode into the valley of death in the Crimean War. And that is simply unacceptable across the political spectrum, not the bogus political spectrum, the two cheeks of the same ass and what lies between them, namely the Liberal Democrats. Not them. They're all gung-ho for our young men, our sons, our grandsons, to be sent into the maw of what could become, as I say, a latter-day Battle of Balaclava, charge of the Light Brigade. We, on the left, as a socialist party, and others who are not remotely supporters of me, of us, or of our ideas, have united on social media, for that is the only place that our position will be heard. Certainly not in Parliament, not if this Speaker of the House of Commons has anything to do with it, not if the current configuration in Parliament has anything to do with it. But on social media, there is an enormous upsurge of opposition to this idea. There's an enormous opposition to it for all the reasons I have adumbrated and more. But I want to dive deeper into why our political class would even consider, never mind actually decide upon, such a course of military folly. Well, the first reason is they don't give a toss about the soldiers. They don't give a toss about Tommy Atkins. They pretend to, as they cheer them off to war, but when Tommy Atkins is lying down in Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester, hooked on smack, hooked on any of the new drugs that they pick up in strange ways prison, they are not present. I've picked up Tommy Atkins in Prince's Gardens. I've done it many times, in fact. I know that the British Armed Forces are abandoned by our government once they've come back from the pointless, needless wars that successive British governments for the last quarter of a century nearly have been sending them into. I know that that's one of the reasons why these men who've never heard a shot fired in anger in their lives are now dressing up in camouflage. Keir Starmer in camouflage? Well, he's a cross-dresser, that's for sure, but he doesn't cut a dash for me as any kind of military leader. Kemi Badenoch, please. Ed Davey, do you think any of them are going into war? You think any of their sons are going into war? No, it's your son, your grandson, your brother, your husband that they intend to send if they were to go ahead with this cockamamie plan. But the second reason is that Britain has lost its empire and has still not found a way, still not found a role for itself. Those of us who supported Brexit, like me, were of the view that Brexit gave us the opportunity to be, for the first time in 100 years and more, a truly independent country, an automatic friend of none, an automatic enemy of none, a country that will look out for the interests of its own people and will seek to trade rather than wage war across the globe. The British ruling elite has not yet found a role. It still dreams as if this was 1825 instead of 2025. And until we shake ourselves from this imperial delusion, we will be at risk of being led by one unpopular prime minister or another into another war to try and rescue their ratings, which is my third point. That Keir Starmer is doing this because he is the most hated prime minister of all time. And I was born when Winston Churchill was the prime minister of Britain. I've lived through many hated prime ministers, including Tony Blair, including Margaret Thatcher, but there has never been a more hated prime minister than Keir Starmer. So much so, he's had to cancel local government elections in May because he knows that his party, his government, will be put to the sword in any elections held in Britain in the foreseeable future. Democracy must prevail, said Starmer in his speech last night, read from a bunch of notes. What kind of prime minister has to read a statement of that importance from a sheaf of papers? What kind of war leader is that? Keir Starmer knows or hopes that by dressing up in military uniform and sending our young men off to die in a war, they will effectively be a tripwire. But they won't be any tripwire in actual fact, because any British soldiers going to Ukraine will have no Article 5 protection. They will not be there as part of NATO. No member of NATO will have any obligation or inclination to respond to any Russian destruction. With one missile, the Oroshenk missile, we could see all of our soldiers destroyed in one strike, and nobody will lift a finger to help us. And that brings me to Donald Trump. Haven't we really come to something? That it's the Americans that are seeking peace and the Europeans that are demanding more war? What kind of cross-dressing is this? So-called liberals, so-called social democrats, even so-called socialists in Europe, in Britain, are demanding war, while Donald Trump, the man they said would take us into World War III, is the only man who is trying to stop it. And the meeting in Riyadh today between Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio, the American Secretary of State, is the future. The sanctions will have to end, said Rubio. All the hotlines are reconnected. All the complex of American-Russian relations have been reestablished. Trump and Putin are about to meet. The war is about to end at last. And amity between Russia and America is about to break out. So what's the British attitude? No, let's stop it. Let's try and blow it up, or rather disable it by blowing up 10,000 British soldiers, your sons and mine. It's come to something, hasn't it? Where it's the American Republican Party that are demanding an end to war, and the so-called leftists and liberals that are demanding more and more of it. Well, we in the Workers' Party, we are not large. We are bigger than any party of our kind has ever been before in the history of Britain in the democratic era. But we are not large, but we have many friends and we have many allies. And so my last word is this. If, as I said, the Queen doesn't have enough soldiers, or the King doesn't have enough soldiers, the only way that Keir Starmer could possibly implement the kind of ludicrous war plans that he has in mind would be to reintroduce conscription in this country. And so I'm here to say to you, but more importantly, I'm here to say to him, if Keir Starmer even dreams of trying to conscript our young working class men and women into the service of his ignoble wars, we will lead and organize a mass movement, no to conscription, a mass movement the likes of which has never been seen since the campaign against the poll tax in the 1980s, which eventually destroyed the government of Margaret Thatcher and consigned the poll tax to the dustbin of history. Don't do it, Prime Minister. And if you insist on doing so, then the first flag-draped coffins of young British service personnel returning from the carnage will destroy your government and your reputation forever. Follow us on social media, the Workers' Party of Britain. Follow No to NATO, No to War. Make sure your Member of Parliament knows exactly what you think of Keir Starmer's game of soldiers. Thanks for watching. I'm George Galloway, leader of the Workers' Party.